expenditure. Yeah, getting real in the real expenditure. So Manisha, you have about 45 minutes to present your work. We'll take clarificatory questions in between and then we'll stand to answer.
Thank you, Bharat. And first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present this work. But first, let me be very, kind of. These are work in progress, very much work in progress. Am I audible? Here it's I don't know about the others. So it is very much work in progress, and therefore any kind of, you can really stop me in between. You can ask any clarificatory questions. Need not be clarificatory. It can be any kind of, concerns and all these things. And I would really like welcome your feedback and everything. So while saying this is very much work in progress, I would also like to mention that a part of it is already finished and it's in the form of a working paper. But now the extended part, we are still working. And by the way, this is also a joint work with my co-author Swati Sri. She is an OP Global University as an assistant professor. So let me get into, just start rolling the camera, action starts here. And so first of all, what we do always, we try to motivate ourselves why we are trying to do this, in which way this is really interesting at all. And if it is interesting, why? So let me go get to the motivations here. And when I try to, using my specs, try to motivate myself. So this is what I found that, this is all what we all know actually, basically, that in the NAS, in the National Account Statistics, the private final consumption expenditure, just normally we use that kind of as an indicator for the welfare and measuring things for the well-being across nations, also within the nations kind of thing. So in these cases, this PFC, I think, yes, the real expenditure that really acts, as an yardstick to measure the economic welfare and therefore compare the living standard across nations. And this has been used extensively by the ICP projects of the World Bank to come out with the PPP. That also we all know. But within the economy, that is at the subnational level, the construction of such real expenditure, it's very much necessary, particularly for a large country like us, which has a lot of heterogeneity. And the ICP project has taken into account the other countries like India, China, Brazil, and all those things, which has a lot of spatial heterogeneity. So at the subnational level also, in order to construct the real expenditure, you really need to have a kind of spatial pattern of the prices. And that has already been cited by some of the articles here. I have just given one. So we try to explore the very basic questions surrounding the measurement of the real expenditure itself. So is it the way it's been reported? Is it a correct way to calculate the real expenditure? It is truly reflecting the welfare. So that's our basic questions, and where we would like to concentrate on the real consumption expenditure, because that is what we normally use as a measure of welfare, and then try to compare whether there is any kind of bias exist or not in the standard way of reporting the real consumption expenditure. And if it is, then what sort of biases do exist? So our now the exploration that suggests that why the real expenditure, that the way it's been defined, is not a comprehensive measure of welfare or even the economic well-being. Here I'm not trying to say like we know the standard GDP or standard that might not be a true reflection of well-being. We might have to take health component, education component. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the expenditure, the real expenditure itself. And the aggregate data, that is the NS, National Account Statistics, that is actually useful in certain scenario, but not always. But it can, to start with, it can provide a great deal of information for us, and which we could link to the welfare analysis. So that was the starting point. And while exploring this, therefore, we took from the National Account Statistics, we took that the private final consumption expenditures, and you know that's been reported. So when we are looking into the current, the nominal and the constant, we found that the nominal TFC, they derive as the constant just by dividing the GDP. So that is the one. And then when we look into the component-wise private final consumption expenditures, so these are, you know, yes, so these are the components, like these are the different types of components that's available in the NS data. They are also, when they derive at the real component-wise private final consumption expenditure, they use the overall, the GDP deflator to arrive at the real one. Okay, so such a standard practice, therefore, we started to think that we know already, it's a well-established fact that using an overall price index, for example, this GDP deflator, that ignores any changes in the component price movement. So the relative price movements, and that's a very well-established fact that has already been actually cited in Wellbauer's paper, that it has a serious implications, the relative price movement on the consumption pattern. So if you just would like to see, so this is the original paper, the prices and inequality that is there. Okay, so screenshot. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So the NAS, as it follows the standard practice of price adjustment using the GDP deflator, we claim that this should be, there should be a component, there could be a component of bias here. So any sort of welfare measurements such as poverty, inequality, using this real reported private final consumption expenditure, that could lead to a biased measure and hence might not be a true representation of the welfare for which you are using this data. So, therefore, we are now trying to provide the different sources of bias, the definitions of the bias that could arrive while you are constructing the real expenditure. What could be the different sources? So here, I'm trying to provide you different definition of these biases. One is in the direction of the relative price movement here. So basically, what is reported normally, originally, is just that whatever be the components or whatever be the total, you just deflate it by the overall, right, the GDP deflate. But truly speaking, one should take into account the component-wise, you know. So here we are trying to provide, to give you the source of bias. So if we construct a kind of the real expenditure where you are considering the different component. For example, F denotes food. This denotes the non-food, and one has to divide it or deflate it by the corresponding CPI. So this is the CPI for food. This is the CPI. Oh, this is wrong. This should be CPI NF. Okay, so this is the non-food one. So this is the one sources of bias. And in order to construct the real consumption expenditure, if you ignore the component-wise price indices, which is basically measuring the relative price positions there. So now we also try to explain that using the national account statistics as well as at the household level using 4 different rounds of NSSO data, the National Sample Survey Organization's NSSO data at the disaggregated level. So this is the first source of bias, which could throw kind of, overestimation or underestimation of any welfare measure, which you would like to do using your real expenditure. Then the other source of bias, which is almost everywhere cited, is the problem with the fixed basket. If you take last year's or if you take fashions, whatever be the price increases, either you are considering the base period quantity or the current period quantity as your, the fixed rate. So we were assuming even if the prices are changing, you keep the constant share there. So that's called the bias due to the fixed basket. So this is already being now talked about. One wants to avoid that by using a Fisher's index formula, which is just a geometric mean of these two. So you really therefore combine the quantities for the base as well as for the current period. But this bias is in the fixed period. So what we normally do therefore, when you combine the all commodity CPI, so this shares, that is the weights. This is basically, so here I'm showing just for food and non-food, but in the account we have the other components. I had shown you the other components. So this is basically based on the budget share of the reference period. That's called the fixed basket kind of thing. And normally it is based on certain round of NSS, like the latest one, which is available based on 2011. So that's the last one, the 68 round of NSS data. So now the CPIs which is available, the time reference is 2012. That's when it is equal to 100. And we have used the baskets, the fixed basket weight based on 2011-12 NSS data, which is the 68 round data. That's what available for us. So, by the way, the green ones are showing that we have finished the work, and the other ones, that is the red, I have not put any color. This is where our work is going on. So we have used the NS data and then, defer the weight. So we introduce the variable weight mechanisms and try to see if there is any, any significant differences between the reported one, which is based on the fixed basket weight, or the variable one. And we are also aiming to do that using now not any more NSS data, because that was not available. So we are now using the CPI, from the CMRE, the Pyramid-X household survey data, which is available since 2014. And in each year, there are 3 waves, and it's really around 2 lakhs of households combining rural and urban sector. So we are utilizing this to come up for the addressing these sorts of bias. Okay, so that's the second one. And then the third one, which we are trying to address in constructing the real expenditure, is the one which is basically all these things we now understand that there is a relative price difference. It's not that the component-wise prices are aligned with the overall. So there is a variation there. If that's what we really try to address, then we should acknowledge the fact that there will be a substitution. You can't ignore the fact that the people will not do the substitution across commodity. As the prices are really moving in different directions, they will do the substitution. Now, if you would like to therefore take into account the substitution possibility due to the relative price movement, then one should use a true cost of living index, which is based on the demand system. So what is that? So therefore, this is basically the true cost of living index is basically the ratios of the expenditure function for a given level of utility. Okay, and you are comparing for two different price scenarios here. Now, in order to arrive at these things, in order to calculate them, what you do, you construct your real expenditure deflating by the true cost of living index, okay, which incorporates the substitutability due to the relative price movements. And that also has not taken into account as it is quite straightforward in the index. Also to say, even when people are really doing something based on the poverty calculations and all these things, based on NSS data, we do report just the real per capita expenditure kind of thing using CPI, which is not based on the true cost of living indexes. So for that, so in order to acknowledge this factor, this source of bias, we are planning to use again the CPHS data, but there is some problem, inherent problem in the CPHS data, which is not the case for the NSS data, at least not for a subset of commodities, but also it has a rich source of information because, and we are planning to use the data since 2014 till 2019, not to take 2020-21, as you know, due to the kind of turbulences. So we don't like to go into this outline years kind of thing. And then we are planning to estimate the demand system and therefore estimate this true cost of living and then deflate the nominal expenditure by this true cost of living and then just see what's the differences if you don't take that into account. So these are the three components of the biases. That's what we are addressing. As I said, the first part we have already finished. This is already for in the submission stage. For the second two part, we have just addressed one part based on the NS, not the consumption expenditure using the CPHS data. But here, I just would like to include that in which way I am trying to build up our model and try to take into account these factors. So this is what the definitions of the bias, which we are really addressing in our work. And then if you look into the usage of the, a kind of literature in this area, as well as the biases, the relative price changes and an implication for the real consumption expenditure and the welfare measurements, these are being used quite extensively in the development economics, in the applied economic literature. For example, using the evidence from Canada, Pendakur showed that the standard way of adjusting the relative price changes by dividing the current, the nominal, with some deflators which are not dependent on the expenditures kind of thing, that might introduce a bias in inequality measure. So what it implies therefore if you take something up overall index and which is because poor and the rich people, they might face a different prices. They are, they might be having a kind of indices which are dependent on that. So if you don't take, that might also create a source of bias. Crawford and Smith also demonstrated that overlooking the effects of differential inflation leads to an overstatement or understatement of the growth of inequality by 6 percentage points during this period. Nicholas, as well, in the study on the distributional consequences of inflation, so specifically on welfare incidences, in Australia, during this time span, distinguished between real and the nominal expenditure inequality by deflating the household's nominal expenditure with some household-specific price deflator. And they found out that inflation had an inequality increasing bias during that. So there is a bias here in when you are measuring inequality. So there are quite a, literature here. So this was due to the different price movements, and there are recently also people started to talk about the fixed rate, the fixed basket one, which says that because the consumption pattern vary over time, so the weights which you are using based on the consumer expenditure survey of 2011 and 12 and then report the CPIs, that might be biased. So, for example, it's being stated the official CPI is more sensitive to food inflation because for the food, there is a much more weightage. This is more than 45%, the weight distribution. However, for share of food expenses, for the period, it has started to fall, kind of thing. So one has to examine why it is so, but this is the fact. This is the observed fact. So these could lead to, therefore, an overestimation and underestimation of inflation measures, and this has been highlighted by Passing also in 2020 cases here. So there is not that the people have not started to look into these. So this is already there. And some of the recent studies exploring the implication of relative price changes on the welfare measures using the NSSO data in the context of India are Misra and Ray, and also my one of my articles there and here, we try to introduce the heterogeneous, the price variation across the nation. So what Misra and Ray showed, that they showed that if you ignore the movements on relative prices, when there is a period of rising inequality and the price changes, that could lead to a huge overstatement of the welfare gain. So you are really in a misleading scenario, therefore. They use a utility-based approach and then they evaluate the distributional consequences of price movements for inequality and the poverty measurements. And they found out that India's official poverty estimates, which has been constructed using the standard CPI, that has an upward bias compared to the poverty estimates computed with a household varying utility-based kind of inflation index. And in our paper, we also examined the effect of both the spatial as well as the temporal price changes on the consumption inequality for this period. And we found that the price changes have been regressive during this period and progressive during this period. So these are like, they could lead to a kind of, so if you don't address, if you just believe in officially reported and do your calculations, like for example, poverty estimates or any kind of inequality measures, that might lead to an erroneous conclusions. That's what we wanted to address from different aspects, and these are our starting points here. So, and then this is also another one, that's the recent one, but it is the latest one available in the World Development Paper. They also show how the conventional measure of consumption inequality based on the reported standard real expenditure is biased depending on how the pattern of relative prices change. So if you ignore that, you might face this problem of these things. So therefore, given this background, we really therefore wanted to explore things. So the first things which we have done, as I told you, that that not the demand system based, not the variable weight, but the first try to take into account the component wise price indices, which takes into account the price variations which are disaggregated in nature rather than merging them and considering just the overall deflator or overall CPI. So using the NAS, National Account Statistics, what we have done. So if you remember, if I go back therefore, and then show you this one. So this is actually a kind of sources. So my apologies, it should be NF. So if you consider the component wise to deflate the component wise expenditure rather than the overall. So in the NAS, from the NAS reported statistics, we deflate the nominal values of components of private final consumption expenditure using component specific CPI 2011-1200. We had to do this because now the reported is 2012 equals to 100. But we converted it to 2011 equals to 100 because the officially reported the constant PFC that is based on 2011. So therefore we translate with that. So that means I compare the reported one and our constructed one. So this is our construct. So we define. So we do the component wise and take the overall. That is the real part. And this is the mean of the reported, this is the mean of our constructed. Our constructed means that's Y double star. That is therefore component wise and they sum it up. And because it is just available since 2011-12 till 2019-20, after that the data is not available. So it's a very few years of observation. That's no, here not food and not food. I just showed using the equation for illustration purpose. I use food and non-food, but I use the components which I have shown which is officially reported, like food, non-alcoholic beverage, their alcoholic and tobacco intoxicant clothing, wellness, all these kind of things. Okay, so because correspondingly the CPIs are also added. So therefore. And then just we compare the equality of the mean using the Mann-Whitney test, which can be applied even for a small sample. So therefore, and that has come out to be insignificant. So there is no significant difference if you use the NAS statistics, whether you deflate with the component wise or by the overall, which is the standard practice, the way NAS reports it. This is the reported one, the mean value. Mean value for across all the years. From 11 till 2019. This is the mean 11 till 2019 based on our Y doubles. Using all the component wise. And there is no significant difference if I use this aggregated data. Then we go to the individual level. So we use therefore household level data using 4 rounds of NSS consumption expenditure survey and try to see so this is the whole span of period. So therefore we use the All India Household Consumption Expenditure Survey by NSS. So we use these rounds 55th, 61st, 66th and 68 corresponding to these years, and so you know. Why do you go to NSS when you don't find any bias there? Because that's an aggregated class. So how do you, because aggregated maybe it's first of all it's not going to take any kind of heterogeneity for the cross and the further. So at the further disaggregated level, which takes into account here, it is not at all the demand system based on preferences. We have not yet touched preferences, but still it's going to take into account across households the preferences. At a much more disaggregated level with more information. That's why we wanted to check for the households. So these are the different rounds which we consider. These are available. So our analysis is carried out both at the All India level as well as at the state level. But just frankly speaking, we have not considered all the states. Okay. So we consider and limit our analysis to the 7 states. And the rationale for choosing these 7 states to illustrate this sorts of bias is that, first of all, the administrative, there are 5 regions, and in each regions, we take only the states which is the highest share of agriculture in the gross state domestic product. So this is the rationale for choosing the 7 illustrative case to demonstrate if there is any such kind of bias between the standard reported expenditure and the constructed one, utilizing the component-wise price indexes. So we use the consumer price index for that based on 1986-87 as 100. That was the, before this 2012 it was 200. Only for 1 or 2 periods there was a 2010 equals to 100, but now it has disappeared. Before that this was the only cases. So to 1986-87 as the reference period, and that we have collected from the laborguru.gov.in. Then component-specific CPIs are used to deflate the consumption expenditure for items. Here at the household level, we are not considering very detailed, but we are considering also food, fuel and light, and the non-food means the residuals one. Okay, so fuel we wanted to consider because we all know the fuel prices move really. It's linked to the international. It really moves sometimes in a very disparate way as opposed to the overall. So these are the 3 broad categories which we consider for our purpose. And we consider the rural households in our analysis, and therefore we use CPI rural laborer, using this as our, the reference year. And the weights for this index, we know these are derived. Weights means W0, the share from the National Sample Survey of the Rural for the 1987-88 NSS data. So the rationale why we have confined ourselves to the rural households, because we know they spend a lot of their consumption expenditure on food, and any kind of poverty or any kind of calculation is majorly driven by the rural households, and that's why we confine ourselves to the rural households. But it can be easily extended to the urban. That's not an issue at all. So, and then use of general price level for the inflation adjustment, we observe it is misleading when food prices are not moving in alignment with the general price level, as it hides the differential impact of the relative price changes on consumption expenditure, and hence the well-being of different income classes, especially for the poorer households. And that's really a critical concern in the Indian context, because a quarter of the Indian population is poor, and India has witnessed episodes where food prices did not align with the general price level. That's our observations when we go to the disaggregated this level. So this is my data description and what we observe. Now I will be explaining you the results also. So traditionally we know that adjustment but the price changes are made by deflating the nominal using the general CPI, ignoring the constituent commodities price movements. That's what our concern. So we define the consumption expenditure, which we arrive by deflating the nominal consumption using the standard CPI as Y star and using component-wise as Y double star. So this is what we have constructed. So to account for variation in the relative price movement while measuring consumption expenditure, we deflate the component-wise expenditure like food, non-food, fuel and light by their specific price indices. So the CPIs for corresponding to that, and these are indices, so therefore these are unit free, so you don't have any problem of when you are aggregating by deflating each component, and that we define as Y double star. So this is, we know that it officially also follows the last pair, so we start with the last pairs one. So this is the CPI all, using the base period quantity. This is for the food. Just for the simplicity, I'm not using the expression for food, fuel and light and other. I'm just giving food and the other, the one. So the food, this is the CPI, and this is the last pairs index for the non-food, corresponding to the prices for the non-food here. So that represents the price vectors within the food vector. So there are several items within the food, there are several items in the non-food, and Qs represents the quantity vector, and 0 and T represents base year and the current year. Okay. So we start with that is we know all. Then we also know that this is the thing. Okay, using the fixed basket methodology. Then the standard expenditure, which is Y star, we are using the notation Y star, which is always given. It is this one, deflating by the overall CPI. So whatever be the constituent commodities, you just add it up and you divide it without ignoring the component price. Now our constructed one is rather this one, where we are using other commodities as well, whether light as well. We can have the other also, the way it's been reported onto in the PFC. So we kept it into the three expenditure categories based on NSS. So remember, these are households level. So then we calculate these one. So these are now, so that Y double star is basically the Y food double star and Y non-food double star. So it's not like the normally reported the standard one. So what is the Y food double star? Y food double star is this one. So what is the CPI? The CPI of food is this one. So using equations 2 and using equation 6, therefore, we can write that YF double star will be this one and YNF double star will be this one. Now, what's about the denominator? The denominator are actually observable from the NSS 43rd round, which is really the basic year for the 1987-88. So, therefore, the one, so this one and this one, you can calculate therefore using equations 2 and 3. What are the equations 2 and 3? Equations 2 and 3 are this. So you know this left hand side, you know the denominator based on the base period NSSO data expenditure, and therefore you can arrive at this values, the numerator here. Now, so we define the bias arising out of this constructed real consumption expenditure, just the difference between these two. So this bias is just the difference between two, the way we had done for the NAS also. Okay. So then this is the difference. So here I just have used, this is for the YF double star, and this is the normal portions where you don't have any price component CPI. These are rather the overall CPIs. So with some rearrangements you get, therefore this is really the the bias, which depends on, now you see the relative price movement of each component as compared to the overall. Okay, so the closer the price movement to the overall, the difference will be close to the zero. However, it could be dominant when the prices of the consumptions component move in the different directions, whether it's higher or lower than the overall price index, which is this one. So based on that, therefore, we arrive at our results for each of the rounds using this NSSO, and for each of the, and for the rural sector, so we use, therefore, that now we have huge number of observations in each year. Okay, so therefore we can use the t-test here and we just test whether the bias is 0 or not. If it is 0, then NAS you can say, okay, it doesn't matter whether you take into account the component wise price deflated or not. But yes, yeah.
We coming with itself coming from base, right? Or mass.
CPI is coming from
Base CPI is calculated base the consumption cost, right? I can do what is from price.
That is the food price. Yeah, this is what we get. You go to the costly side, then you get CPI overall, CPI all, CPI food, CPI fuel, and all. So these are component wise. Now, how does it arrive? Also, within the food, there are features like cereals, like pulses, like all this, and they have been provided also the ways based on, in this case, 98%. And the weighted average of all these things, that's what we take or that aggregate level of the component levels. Okay, so that's the way to do that. Okay, so what is our observations here? That our findings based on this measure of bias, which is basically the difference, suggests that if we ignore the changes in the relative price movements, that leads to an overstatement of the consumption expenditure. That means it is underrepresenting the poor. The standard one is really inflating the real expenditure, so underrepresents the poor. The statistical evidence that the mean difference between these two is significantly different from zero, therefore supports our concern about the disregard for the relative price movements and its implications for the household consumption expenditure. So what we have done, so this is really for the, for the rural sector, for all India, and for the 7 states, for the 4 lines. So these are Y star are the standards reported using overall CPI at the rural level, and Y double star like our component Y stipulated and then sum it up. And you can see that therefore, and the way we have defined our bias is Y double star minus Y star. So therefore, Y star is mostly much more than Y double star. So this overestimates the real expenditure, therefore underestimates the incidence of poverty, except the years which I have highlighted here for Punjab and for Bihar. The things in those years, we found that in Punjab actually the non-food price indices was less than the overall for that year. And for Punjab being a rich state, the expenditure share on the non-food is much more. That was the case. Then for Bihar, just the opposite. Being a poorer state, their expenditure share on food is much higher, and the food prices for those years was less than the overall CPI. And at the same time, in 2009 and 10, there was elections going on, so the incumbent actually initiated a lot of populist measures, and that sort of created the, that in a different direction, these differences here. So that is for the overall conclusions for the 7 states. Otherwise, in majority, always actually Y double star is less than Y star. Fine enough. We found this bias based on this disaggregated micro level data. Then we would like to analyze what's the implication on the welfare. And hence, we calculate an inequality there, which is a very standard way of measuring a kind of welfare there. So for this purpose, we make a distinction between inequality estimated based on the Y star, the standard real expenditure, and the constructed one, which is the Y double star. And we use the standard Gini coefficient here. So this is really the relative price movements and its implication on the welfare based on a measure of consumption inequality. This is for the all India rural households here. So you can see the blue line is the standard consumption expenditure in the constant base year period, and the orange one is based on our constructed one here. So the assessment of, and this is for the 4 rounds which we have considered. So starting from 1999 till 2012. Okay. So assessment of the temporal, this pattern, you can see that consumption inequality faced by the rural households of India that shows that Indian rural households have been witnessing an increase in the consumption inequality. Slowly, but it has a kind of increase that we will see. However, we find that the inequality estimates based on the standard real expenditure that overstates actually inequality compared to the estimates based on the real consumption expenditure. If you remember the references which is cited, they also talked about overestimation or underestimation of the inequality measures. For example, in case of the UK and Australia, they also had done that. So inequality, therefore, calculations which does not incorporate the effect of the relative price changes, we have noticed that overestimates, therefore, the level of, the consumption inequality compared to the inequality that takes into account the relative price adjustments. Then we wanted to see how much the poor and the rich, they are being affected. So what we have done, therefore, we consider the lowest quartile and the, in the income distribution, per capita income distribution for the rural households, consider the lowest quantile and the upper quantile, and we segregated these two subsamples and follow the same calculations. And if you look there, the inequality that does not account for the movements in the relative prices, that actually understates for the rural, but the difference becomes insignificant over the time. So it really doesn't matter for them. But the overall trend which we have noticed here, that remains actually that overstating for the rich, that is that there for the, the richer sections of the households here. So any kinds of, so this is really a representations of the bias, which is, it's a very simple, that I'm just ignoring the component, but even that is going to give me these sort of results. Then think of the other sources of the bias that could also lead to what sort of, because here state I'm assuming fixed basket and have not incorporated the variable weights mechanisms here. So then, therefore, so this has already been published here in the form of, and it's in the process of things. Now I would like to show the bias from using a kind of the fixed rates. So we calculate, therefore, we do the same thing. NAS at aggregate level and then the CPHs. Now, not anymore the NSS, we can do this for the NSS as well, but we are planning to do using the CPHs. So how we do that? We calculate, therefore, we change the weights. So every year, you have national account statistics, the total PFC and the component-wise PFC. So you just take the share every year. And therefore, you combine, you calculate your CPIs, which will be not anymore W naught into CPI, it will be WT into CPIs. So the weights are going to change here every year. And that has also been actually, given here. The Basin, as I said, it's meant actually, the article had come. And then it's in a working paper and there's some sort of, that has come in the ideas for India. There also, they have talked about, they actually changed the kind of, the weights based on the CPHs and our NSS data. They have seen the over time, the weightage for the food has decreased, and that's going to have an implication on the calculation of the real, on the calculations of the weightage. But they have not moved to the real expenditure, not. So, yes, so this is what we are trying. So here, rather than 0, we are actually having corresponding to T. This will be T as well. So this is, we construct the variable weight CPI for each year. And then we deflate accordingly the total PFC and construct. And then we can see that this is the magnitude. So this is again for the 9 years, because N is available for the 9 years, starting from 2011-12. And here also it shows no significant difference, even if you take the data. Okay, so aggregated data really, it must kind of smooth out something. Even the current, the nominal values are reported like it's an average value. So it's not going to show the heterogeneity across households, but if you look, because on the poverty calculations and inequality, we can't take the same steps. Furthermore, we don't have rural-urban distinction in their steps. So if we would like to really see the implications on the rural poor and all these things, we won't be able to do our exercise. So that sort of drives us more towards the much more disaggregated, household. Yes. No, I could not, I just had done that because narcotic means there is no significant difference that we found. Now for we have used inequality, we can use the poverty calculations also using both Webster and Webster. We haven't done that. We just have looked into the inequality, but that is easily can be done. See, but you see that you already see that there is an overestimation in the Webster. So you would be able to see, so therefore poverty is still so you are going to see that greater than the critical level of the poverty level. So there will be more.
I was asking is that because when I look at the percentage from ratio is this percentage higher or lower, that helps me to generalize the thing in a much comfortable manner.
So we can produce the values of the poverty rates or from using Webster and all that. That's not it. And we can even do this is at the state level. So we have done the state level. So that we can do. But we haven't done that.
But your quartile data shows that actually the estimation changes when you talk about the poor.
Poorer quartile, it shows that over time there is no such significant differences in terms of inequality.
Slightly. If the direction changes. So overall poverty estimates they actually may increase rather than decrease.
From the inequality can we infer that? Because overall it shows that Webster overestimates. But in the case of a poor, in inequality, the trend shows the inequality, which is in the opposite direction, as you rightly pointed out. But from the inequality, can we directly infer whether the poverty will be more or less?
Actually, that leads to the people will come to other biases. It could be quantity base rate biases, it could be other biases. Suppose you bring in all the biases, will they cancel out?
Oh, that could be a kind of issues, but these two biases, this 6 to 8 variable weight and the first one, that I can incorporate and do in that NSS value because that could be done. But the preference based one, which I'm going to talk about, incorporating the third source also will it won't match.
If you bring in these 3-4 sources, can be decomposed?
No, the third one I cannot combine with the first. The third one is the true cost of living index is purely different one that I cannot bring because the first one is based on the CPIs, the reported CPIs, and the definition itself. But the third one, I'm going to construct the price index.
And there will be.
But these two I can do. And
the most important is actually the third one because
most
you are
important is the third one.
And there, if the states if you do quintile wise, will that be a better way of addressing the?
Yes, exactly. This is what I was trying to say. The kind of because the true cost of living kind of you really raised a very important question. The true cost of living, which is basically comparing the two price positions kind of thing, they only acknowledge the substitution. And I would like to, get the values from my demand system, get the prices, how the prices, with expenses to the prices, how. But it's not going to address your concern whether it is different for the different quantities of the income ranges. That is called a non-homothetic preferences. So I will therefore we can incorporate that also while I estimate the true cost of living by having the true cost of living dependent on the income quantity. That can address this concern. And people actually the 2017 World Development paper, they actually introduced this non-homogeneous theory. And they concluded they had done it using the NSSO data, and their conclusion is that when you try to see the bias in terms of inequality, they haven't done perfect in terms of inequality, they found out that the substitution component, which is there in the normal PSNI, is lesser dominant than this non-homogeneous inequality. That is income dependent or the quantile dependent true cost. So what is really what you try to say or what you see from management. So that's what they also found. So this is but unfortunately I cannot combine the third sources of mass with the first two sources. But I can combine the first two together. And then you can see it's not may not be actually compensate each other, but it might aggravate the form of the bias. So that's my hunch.
Manisha, I have one question on the NSS signal. You know also that the NSS estimate of consumption and the NAS estimates are vast. That difference is actually large. Okay. How does that affect your estimation? Also keep in mind that the NSS is on the right side, it doesn't capture the right side of the thing.
Right side
of the distribution doesn't capture properly.
Yes, because your sample size is
Sampling is
mostly
problem.
in the
So even these issues with the NSS one and the difference in the case, the NSS estimation. So how much of the difference
means in the conclusion.
in the aggregate consumption?
Yeah.
So, how much of the difference between Y and Y star and Y double star that you are getting can be
Only for that factor, for that, because I don't have any other information spontaneous for that. I can only work with because NAS just gives you this accurate values. You don't have any other the components.
differently? I mean, you take the observed numbers, the reported numbers of NAS, so you know by how much, what is the differential? You know the percentage.
Yes, at the state, yes, all India and all these things, you can calculate.
My question is, so NAS to NSS, whatever is reported, there is a certain ratio. Is it the same as what you are getting wider stuff? Or how drastically are these ratios?
No, then I.
So then
I
question,
have to know. Yes, what if I'm getting it right, then I have to calculate the ratios of Y star itself, not Y star and Y double star. Y star itself from NAS and Y star itself from the NAS. So that ratio and Y double star from NAS and the Y double star from NAS. So, and then see whether insignificant. That sort of give you some idea. Otherwise, you do not have any other information to,
yeah, we may not be able to attribute, but at least we know how much of the way they are worked out is carried through in your
or whether this kind of disaggregated information, how much it's been merged for you to represent it as an accuracy.
Right.
I have a follow-up kind of question. That is, you bring Y star from both the things and Y double star from both the things.
Yes.
Now, suppose we get an understanding of how this pattern is over this report. Now, the fact that we don't have consumption expenditure officially shared with us after 11, 12, 17, 18 being shared aside. So now, can we use some knowledge of this, both the Y star and Y double star, to use NAS data for the recent years and then use that to say what could be the pattern of because you generate distributions, so that distribution across states, rural, across content and whatever, or decide
we
whatever you want to get.
we won't be able to have the correspondence for the, we have to have that for the all India level because NAS
We don't actually, is it possible for you to generate something and then we can from that include say poverty, inequality?
Aggregated level, the values are given also from that. even if you would like to extrapolate and
All India aggregated.
all India just to one values.
But at least you can get state-wise.
You can get the, yeah, because there are like the state PVPs, the state things are available. So that variations, and I have to think of that because with just one or two values, I am not so sure whether we'll be able to have, because the white star, one thing is that I might be able to extrapolate them because the tables shows only the mean values, the differences. I won't be able to generate the whole distributions. I might be able to extrapolate some, set of measures like mean and I don't think I'll be able to generate it.
But if you would have had, say, rural urban distribution or say something like that, that GDP in that sense, would that be possible? Just a hypothetical.
Right now, I can't think it is possible, but I will think of it. Right now, I don't think it's possible, even if we have a NAS, rural and urban divisions. Even then, it is not possible. Generate something which would reflect like an MSS. And you would like to generate from the MSS. And why would you like to generate? Because you would like to have a distribution. No. If you don't get the distribution, then it has no meaning. I don't see from this one. Even then, I don't think about it. Even when I am. But this one, it's easily doable. This is easily doable. This is more good. One thing, yes, that's to say, Swati, if you could write down the comments, that would be great. I really appreciate that. Yes.
So the characteristics wrap up.
Yeah, now I would like to, yeah, so because we have to really that it up. Okay, so yeah, okay, so this is my intentions now. We are going to take these because accordingly the CPIs are available for these commodities. So we can really therefore create these 5 commodity groups, even if we are taking the household level expenditure data, because the CPIs are available like this. And then I just would like to really wrap it up by saying that since the overall, we know that CPI fails to account for the overall welfare gains. So we would like to account for the price induced substitution by calculating the true cost of living index, which is basically the ratio of expenditure to attain the same utility level at 2 different time points for 2 different price situations, and by keeping the reference utility. But for doing these, what we are trying to do now, so this is the ratio which we try to estimate now, which is much more because it takes into account your preferences and then the induced substitutions. Okay, so we are, so P naught, as you know. So, but the thing is that in order to estimate these, you need some demand system because these are the expenditure functions. So we are now using the weights, which is the much more, the demand system that has been used in the literature. So this demand system is in this form, and based on these forms, so here you see these are the function of prices. So I need the price information. That's the challenging task because price information is not given nowhere. So only NSSO data, you have the quantity and the total expenditure for certain commodities, not for all the non-food commodities. So you can construct the unit values, which is a proxy for the prices. But for the CPHS data, there is no quantity information, only the expenditure information. So the prices is the challenge, which we are now trying to overcome. And then we are going to estimate this equation. Now look, this is the T. So that T denotes every time point starting from 2014 to 2019. And based on that, I am going to get, so this is my time points, and those are my 5 commodity groups. Okay, and based on that, I'm going to calculate my that total true cost of using the dot for, and then replace my y with this one. Now, as you rightly pointed out, I could do it for the different ones and which is different for that. That sort of actually takes into account non-homotopy differences, because we are not assuming the same difference pattern for all the income points here. So this is what we are trying, and to get the prices, because price data is not available, and I'm trying to now use these places. So therefore, we are going to use another paper of mine in 2015, and our recent paper also there, which basically uses. So this is the main reference. I'm just showing you the reference, and I stop here because then you know that why I'm using these references to calculate this system. This one. Okay, so this is one, and then I'm going to use the Calcutta planning model, which we have used in our paper, and then therefore I'm going to use spatial prices, because if I have to estimate for different households, I should have price variations happening, because households are like 1 lakh, and I don't have 1 lakh different prices because I don't have input values. But I should have at least some variation in the prices. So I'm planning to introduce district level prices. So the variation will be like at 530, 530, 90 states. So there this district level prices I can obtain by using this paper, the reference, and the other, which where spatial heterogeneity, the reference would be all India. So that is the base. And the temporal would be based on 2014. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm going to use therefore a base here, that takes into account the temporal price movement. Otherwise, you won't be able to get PCLI, which is a comparison between PT and P0. And when you are introducing the spatial heterogeneity of the prices, you have to have some numerator. So that's what we are going to do the all India, which will be equals to 100. So that's the plan of the status. So I think that's the issue. Anyway, by the way, I also wanted to show this slide. Anyway,
I just looking at the website question. From your side, is it possible to tell and decide the discussion that has happened? Why is there the inequality between these two estimates? The thing that you have shown, your blue and orange. 2004-5, the gap actually is much bigger. Whereas 9-10, the gap is much less.
Yes. So,
and that holds for in your rich and poor.
rich and poor is disappearing factor. It might be then that for that I had in my paper the CPI for food and all the components of the CPI all. You will see over the time they are much more aligned. There is not much, it's not that CPI all is kind of moving in a different direction than the components. We are moving maybe in a aligned way, so the relative prices are not that big. That might be the one of the causes. That's what we found when we plotted the CPI. So then you should not find any bias at all. No, we found the biases at the disaggregated level kind of things. The bias, there could be statistically still significant. See, the statistically significant, but the pattern, but the overall the feature is reducing.
So the bias is reducing over time.
Bias is reducing over time. That should lead to the inequality gap is reducing over time. But still they are significant bias. But whether bias is reducing over time, we can have a look into the table, the value, because I said that, but I'm not so sure. I have plotted the bias also.
Will it forfeit the biases gap between?
No, this is the inequality gap. This is really after calculating the inequality kind of things. Biases, I have this plot in my paper kind of things, but not here. But it's not that, yes. It's not that it's reducing too much.
Yeah,
It's
because
not.
it's not obvious that the reduction in bias is translated.
It is a reduction in
Yeah.
inequality because in the inequality the other components also. So that's not. So this is what we found. I will incorporate this and I will think of this one.
Yeah, I'd also like to know how.
But now I would also like to do in this paper itself because we are now submitting it. I thought I'm not only taking into account this because I will also incorporate the variable variables, the two sources, and then I will see which sources is majorly driving the results. These two I can do, but I cannot combine it first.
But there is one question when you go on between the national account, CPI, and the NSS. Is how, I mean, I agree that the NSS will be a place into unit values for at least for the food commodities.
For food commodity and some
But the
non-food.
question is, even for the food commodities, does the CPI act, say for CPI for rice or CPI for seed, does it track the change in the unit value of the NSS capture? This is a question by itself.
No. So I want to see my.
Because these 4 rounds you
No,
get.
in this world development paper, by this you can have a look at this paper. So in this paper, they have shown, they have calculated the unit values and then the 4 rounds of, where is my letter? Or English. If I want to just stop sharing, then it will be this one. This one. They have taken 5 rounds of analysis. We have calculated externally for 2 unit values are present. So they price indices using the unit value and they have given the officially reported CPI 2 also. They are more or less following a similar kind of pattern. So I have this in here. I could show you the table. It is in this paper in table 6 that has been reported. Okay, but there is a problem in the unit values.
That's quality issue.
Quality. Exactly. They also, because Beaton have already provided how to take care of the quality, so they estimated that equation using the CPRD model. So that sort of takes into account the quality, and then they reported that is more or less corroborating with the reported for the 5 rounds of the starting from 1992, 93, 2000. Missing, we are missing the NSS data. Very missing NSS data.
If you use some back channel, can get 17.
I know. I knew one person who is working in the NSS office in Calcutta. He actually told me in 2018 that we will now immediately get the data kind of thing, and then it stopped. I can again now I can channelize that my action, but I don't think we will be able to. But it has started now. Chandrasekhar told me that because also I do have 2 of my friends who are my from the NSC batches. They are working in NSS, so I'm CSO. So I will try to use, but they will not be without the government permission.
We should not discuss it.
Yeah, yes. But even then, even if I get, I won't be able to publish it. I won't be able to report it. That's also a problem. But you see, we are really struggling. 2017, 18 could have occupied so many things. The demonetization, 2016 kind of thing. So CPA does have a lot of information, but it lacks several information which is needed for us. Like we are used to the consumer demand system and all these things. So it's a challenge. So you can leave. Don't have to stay here with people arguing.
Just as an aside, suppose you are working over time, and suppose certain commodities or commodities they either go out or come, let's say mobile.
Exactly.
How do you address that when you are doing this?
Because that is the problem now. So therefore, in the X2X system, that problem is there because one commodity comes in the other commodity. So therefore, ideally, you should for the food it doesn't matter. For the non-food item, you should actually look for the different rounds. What is the percentage share? The average, we can take the median share, and then we can construct the W naught accordingly. Then the problem would be okay, adjust the W. But then you are going to take the CPI from the official steps. That has taken place already.
87.
It's not 87, 8, 2012, but even then, so you won't be able to match. So you have to take only that component in your W, which are also embedded in the CPIs. But you can avoid that while you are using your unit value regressions kind of thing. Here you have the liberty. You can take whatever and then based on your sample weight, you can do the estimations. So in that way, but I won't define because I'm trying to use CPHs, but the problem with this model, that is possible. Actually, it has been provided in 2018 paper. Amitadi also they have given this ratio. So I'm going to use my other model, but using this is already been provided actually originally by Newell in 1989. It is based on, I'm telling you, it's a very old paper based on the concept of Barton in 1964, which says that you can consider and equivalized like a demographic component, the equivalized income as a substitute like the prices. If somebody has entered in your family, so your life you have to sacrifice some commodities. So that way it's called the pseudo unit values. So that's the one I have.
That's what you're planning to
the pseudo unit values, which came from the Barton 1964 paper, then followed by Newell, and this is the only paper who has actually used. Newell actually had not that in mind. He wanted to do the equivalent scale, but they actually used it to calculate the pseudo unit values, and this paper in 2018 used that for the regional price level construction. I have to have the price level, otherwise I won't be able to estimate the demand system and then estimate the true cost of living. So that is, now I just have a one, if you give me a suggestion, because the first paper is already finished here, but I can accommodate that variable weight may be there. And do I do the last part, the TCA, like is completely a separate one? No, I cannot add. I was planning to incorporate the variable weight part, which will also take into account the CPHs with the TCA. That's what my initial plan was that the first part was done. Should I add the variable weight there, or should I keep it in the process? That is my dilemma. Otherwise, I'm done with the first part. Except this is the way. This is why I have to take my decisions. I have to do whether I should take that kind of variable weight, but variable weight is very much different from the TCA. So maybe I should take into the first part.
So what is when you have the credit price versus and so naturally you are going to get some biases. Now, why should we invest in the price?
Measuring the bias. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for your suggestions and
That is not for you. It must be very important for you.